Chapter 1. The Warning.
Mommy, the baby wants to say something.
My 5-year-old son's voice carried across the room, pulling my attention away from the steaming cup of tea my sister-in-law had just placed before me. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the living room windows, making the steam from the tea dance like ghostly fingers in the air. The heavy velvet curtains, a wedding gift from Robert, framed the scene like an ominous painting. "What is it, sweetie?" I asked, though something in his tone made my stomach tighten with unease. I watched as he stood there in his favorite dinosaur pajamas, their once bright colors, now softened from countless washes, his small face unusually serious. The T-Rex on his chest seemed to glare at Michelle with beady eyes. He pointed at Michelle, his small finger unwavering.
The baby says that lady is going to make her disappear.
The delicate teacup froze halfway to my lips. Across the table, Michelle's perfectly manicured hand twitched, her face draining of color so quickly, it was as if someone had pulled a plug. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly in the sudden silence, each second stretching like taffy. A car alarm wailed in the distance, its sharp notes cutting through the tension like a knife.
What did you say, you little brat?
Michelle's voice cracked like a whip as she took a threatening step toward my son. Her designer heels clicked ominously against the hardwood floor. The sound reminded me of a ticking time bomb. With deliberate slowness, I set down my untouched tea and pushed it toward her. The porcelain made a soft scraping sound against the polished wood. "Well then, Michelle, why don't you drink this instead?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds outside seemed to have stopped their evening chorus. The only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioning and Michelle's increasingly rapid breathing. She stared at the cup as if it were a coiled snake. Her perfectly lined lips parted, then closed again. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, leaving behind only the lingering scent of her expensive perfume and the echo of her clicking heels. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is how I discovered just how far my sister-in-law would go to get what she wanted. I met James Mitchell on a crisp autumn morning while working at his father's company, Mitchell Enterprises. The air had that particular October bite to it, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. Some might call it a cliché, falling in love with the boss's son, but James was different from what you'd expect. Despite being heir to a successful business empire that spanned 3 continents, he never acted superior or entitled. Instead, he approached each day with genuine humility and dedication, always eager to learn from others regardless of their position. I still remember our first real interaction. The office was buzzing with end-of-quarter activity, the sound of typing and phone conversations creating a steady hum of productivity. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over my cubicle where I was buried in spreadsheets, my half-empty coffee cup long forgotten. A gentle knock on my cubicle wall caught my attention, and there he stood, his tie slightly askew and his arms full of papers. "Sarah, could you help me with these quarterly reports?" he'd ask, an apologetic smile playing across his face. His dark hair was slightly ruffled, as if he'd been running his fingers through it in frustration. "I've seen how you organize data, and honestly, you're much better at this than I am. The way you structured last month's analysis was brilliant." I remember feeling my cheeks warm at his praise, trying to maintain my professional composure, even as my heart did a little skip. "Of course," I replied, clearing a space on my desk. "Here, let me show you how I approach these." That was James, honest, hardworking, and completely devoid of pretense. He had his endearing habit of running his hand through his dark hair when he was concentrating, and his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he finally understood a complex concept. During that first impromptu training session, I caught myself watching those little expressions more than I probably should have. It didn't take long for me to fall head over heels for him. Our late-night work sessions gradually evolved into coffee breaks, then lunch dates, and finally dinner outside the office. Each moment revealed new layers to his character that only made me fall deeper. Of course, being such a catch meant James had no shortage of admirers. The office was always full of perfectly coiffed women who just happened to need his help with something. or who would laugh a little too loudly at his jokes during meetings. There was Vanessa from legal, who always seemed to time her coffee breaks with his, and Catherine from marketing, who wore increasingly dramatic outfits that somehow still adhered to corporate dress code. I still remember the whispers and sideways glances when we first started dating. The break room would suddenly go quiet when I walked in, only to erupt in hushed conversations as soon as I left.
Did you hear? James Mitchell is dating someone from accounting,
one would whisper.
I heard she's just a financial analyst. What could he possibly see in her?
Another would reply, not quite quietly enough.
She must be really good with numbers,
someone once said with a snicker, the implication clear in their tone. But to everyone's surprise, including my own, our relationship progressed smoothly. James was unfailingly kind and attentive, never letting the office politics affect our growing connection. He'd bring me coffee in the mornings, remembering exactly how I liked it, 1 sugar, splash of cream. He'd leave little notes on my desk, usually terrible puns about spreadsheets that somehow made me laugh anyway. Our colleagues, rather than resenting us, gradually became our biggest supporters. Maybe it was because they could see how genuine our connection was, or perhaps they were just tired of watching the parade of socialites who used to vie for James' attention.
You two just fit,
my closest work friend Lisa had told me during my engagement. We were sharing lunch in the break room, and she was admiring my modest but elegant engagement ring. The afternoon sun caught the diamond, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the wall.
It's like watching one of those romantic movies where everything just falls into place. The way he looks at you, Sarah, that's the real deal.
If only she knew what was waiting for me after the credits rolled. The first sign of trouble came from my in-laws, or more specifically, my sister-in-law. James's mother had passed away before our marriage, leaving behind a father and 2 children who processed their grief in vastly different ways. The loss had carved different shapes in each of them, like water wearing away at rock, revealing what lay beneath the surface. Robert Mitchell, my father-in-law and the company president, shared his son's genuine nature. When James first introduced me as his girlfriend at a company Christmas party, Robert's warm smile immediately put me at ease. The party was in full swing, with holiday music playing softly in the background and the scent of mulled wine and cinnamon hanging in the air. He had James's kind eyes and the same gentle demeanor that had drawn me to his son. "Welcome to the family," he'd said, pulling me into an unexpected but heartfelt hug. His cologne smelled of cedar and warmth, reminding me of my own father. "Please, call me father. Mr. Mitchell is too formal, and Robert just makes me feel old," he added with a chuckle that made his eyes crinkle, just like James's did. The Mitchell family photos that decorated their sprawling Victorian home told a story of modest living despite their wealth. Each image seemed to capture a moment of genuine joy, frozen in time behind spotless glass. In one, a young James and Michelle sat on their father's shoulders at what appeared to be a county fair, cotton candy sticking to their cheeks. In another, their mother, beautiful and vibrant before illness took her, taught a teenage James how to grill burgers in their backyard, both wearing matching Kiss the Cook aprons. I would often find myself studying these photos during family gatherings, trying to piece together the puzzle of how the smiling little girl in pigtails had transformed into the Michelle I knew today. The frames showed family camping trips where they all wore practical clothes smudged with dirt, backyard barbecues with paper plates and plastic cups instead of fine china, and holiday celebrations where everyone wore casual clothes and genuine smiles. James still used the leather wallet I'd given him years before our marriage, its worn edges a testament to his sentimental nature. One evening, as we were getting ready for bed, I caught him carefully transferring his cards to a new wallet Michelle had given him, some designer brand I couldn't pronounce, only to switch back to my old gift the next day. "The other one's too flashy," he'd explain with a sheepish smile when he caught me noticing. "Besides, this one's got character." Robert kept his late wife's fountain pen on his desk, using it daily for important documents even after decades had passed. I once watched him sign a multi-million-dollar contract with that same pen, ignoring the expensive Mont Blanc set Michelle had insisted on buying him for Christmas. Margaret always said a contract signed with love carries more weight than one signed with gold, he told me quietly when he caught me eyeing the pen. His voice had carried a weight of memory that made my heart ache. But Michelle was cut from a different cloth entirely. Chapter 2. A Family Divided. The first time I met Michelle Mitchell, she was descending the grand staircase of the family home, like a queen making her entrance at court. The late afternoon sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows caught the diamonds at her throat, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the walls. She was dressed head to toe in designer brands that probably cost more than my yearly salary, each step deliberate and graceful in her red-soled heels. The sound of those heels clicking against the hardwood created a steady rhythm that seemed to match my increasing heartbeat. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, feeling woefully underdressed in my department store blouse and pencil skirt, watching her descend like some modern-day Scarlett O'Hara. Her perfectly styled, honey blonde hair and immaculate makeup screamed President's daughter, but it was her eyes that told the real story, cold and calculating, completely at odds with the warmth I'd found in James and Robert. Those eyes reminded me of a shark's, dark, bottomless, and utterly devoid of empathy. They seemed to scan me from head to toe, cataloging every imperfection, every sign that I didn't belong in her world.
Oh, you must be the secretary James is dating, she said, her voice dripping with barely concealed disdain.
She paused halfway down the stairs, one manicured hand resting on the polished banister. A massive diamond ring sparkled on her finger, catching the light with every subtle movement.
How quaint.
The word quaint seemed to hang in the air between us, sharp as a paper cut. I could feel heat rising to my cheeks, but I forced myself to maintain my composure. Years of presenting financial analysis to demanding executives had taught me how to keep my voice steady, even when my insides were churning. Actually, I work in financial analysis, I'd corrected her gently, trying to maintain a smile despite the flush creeping up my neck. It's nice to meet you, Michelle. James has told me so much about you. She'd responded with a dismissive, and swept past me as if I were part of the furniture, leaving behind a cloud of expensive perfume that made my eyes water. The scent was overwhelming, a mixture of jasmine and something else I couldn't quite identify, probably some rare flower that only bloomed once a century on a remote mountainside. The same pattern continued through our engagement, our wedding, and every family gathering that followed. Each interaction with Michelle was like navigating a minefield while wearing a blindfold. One wrong step, one misplaced word, and the explosion would follow. The situation only worsened after marriage. During my visits to the family home, Michelle would materialize like an imperious ghost, barking orders as if I were her personal servant. She had a way of appearing exactly when I was most comfortable, shattering any sense of peace I might have found in the Mitchell home. One particularly memorable afternoon, I was enjoying a quiet moment in the family library, curled up in a warm, leather armchair with the first edition of Pride and Prejudice that Robert had kindly allowed me to read. The room smelled of old books and leather, with dust motes dancing in the sunbeams that streamed through the tall windows. It was perfectly peaceful until...
Sarah, make some tea.
The sharp command cut through the silence like a knife. Michelle stood in the doorway, not even looking up from her phone, her fingers tapping away at the screen.
And not that cheap stuff you drink at home. Use a Ceylon blend in the blue tin.
Or another time, during a family dinner.
Sarah, those dishes won't wash themselves.
This, despite the fact that the Mitchell household employed a full staff of housekeepers, who Michelle had mysteriously dismissed for the evening. I'd bite my tongue, reminding myself that we only saw each other occasionally. Still, each interaction left me wondering how James and Michelle could possibly be siblings. Where James was kind and considerate, Michelle was cruel and selfish. Where he was humble despite their wealth, she flaunted every penny of it. In quiet moments, I would sometimes catch her staring at old family photos, particularly ones featuring their mother. Her expression in these moments was different, softer, almost vulnerable. But the moment she realized she was being watched, her face would harden again, like a steel door slamming shut. "Don't let her get to you," James would say after particularly trying encounters, massaging my shoulders as I tried to decompress in our cozy apartment, far from the oppressive grandeur of the Mitchell mansion. Michelle's been different since Mom died. She took it harder than any of us. I would lean back into his touch, letting his warm hands work out the knots of tension Michelle's presence always left in my muscles. I know, but... But what? He'd prompt gently when I trailed off. I wanted to point out that loss doesn't excuse cruelty, that grief isn't a free pass to treat others like dirt beneath your designer shoes. I wanted to tell him about the way Michelle's eyes followed me around rooms, calculating and cold, or how her seemingly casual comments about my background always carried a sting. But I held my tongue. After all, who was I to judge how someone processed their grief? After marriage, I continued working at the company for a while, finding satisfaction in my role and the respect I'd earned there. The familiar rhythm of numbers and spreadsheets provided a welcome escape from the tension at family gatherings. My office became my sanctuary, a place where merit mattered more than family connections or designer labels. Then, one spring morning, everything changed. I was in the master bathroom of our apartment, watching as 2 pink lines appeared on the pregnancy test. The morning light filtered through the frosted window, casting a soft glow over the marble countertop. My hands trembled as I checked the test again, then double-checked the box to make sure I was reading it correctly. I still remember the moment I told James. We were having breakfast on our apartment balcony, something we did every Sunday when weather permitted. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold, and the sounds of the city waking up drifted up from below. The coffee pot burbled cheerfully in the kitchen, and the scent of freshly baked croissants from the bakery downstairs wafted through the air. James had just taken a sip of coffee when I placed the positive test on the table beside his plate. He was wearing his favorite weekend shirt, a soft blue button-down that was starting to fade at the collar, and his hair was still messy from sleep. His eyes widened, coffee forgotten mid-sip. Are we? I nodded, unable to contain my smile. My heart was racing so fast I could barely get the words out. We're going to have a baby. The joy that spread across his face in that moment made all of Michelle's snide remarks and cold shoulders worth it. He jumped up so quickly he knocked over his chair, pulling me into an embrace that lifted me off my feet. Coffee splashed across the table, but neither of us cared. We're going to have a baby, he repeated, his voice full of wonder. Then he set me down abruptly, concern replacing joy. His hands fluttered down around me like nervous butterflies. Should you be standing? Do you need to sit down? Are you feeling okay? We should call Dr. Morrison right away. And we need to start baby-proofing the apartment, and... I couldn't help but laugh at his sudden shift from excitement to worry, placing my hands over his to still their nervous movement. I'm pregnant, not made of glass, I told him, but his fussing warmed my heart. It was so typically James, the same caring nature that had first drawn me to him, now directed toward our unborn child. That evening, as we lay in bed discussing our future, James's hand resting protectively over my still flat stomach, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since before our wedding. This was our family now, growing and changing in wonderful ways. The next morning, I scheduled an appointment with my doctor and began researching everything I could about pregnancy and childbirth. James threw himself into preparation with the same dedication he showed at work, coming home each day with new books, articles, and recommendations from colleagues who'd been through it before. We decided to wait until after the first trimester to share the news with family. Those 12 weeks felt like an eternity, especially during family dinners where Michelle's sharp eyes seemed to notice my untouched wine glass and sudden aversion to certain smells. But somehow, we managed to keep our secret. When we finally announced the pregnancy at a family dinner, Robert's face lit up with joy. He immediately raised his glass in a toast, his voice thick with emotion. To new beginnings, he said, his eyes glistening. Margaret would have been so proud. Michelle's reaction was different. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Well, she said, swirling her wine glass. I suppose congratulations are in order. No, I do hope you're not planning to raise it in that tiny apartment of yours. A Mitchell heir deserves better than a walk-up in the city. I'd been blessed with our first child, and I chose to dedicate myself fully to motherhood. The decision wasn't easy. I loved my work, the satisfaction of solving complex financial puzzles, the respect I'd earn among my colleagues. But something told me I needed to be home with our baby. Call it mother's intuition. Those early days of motherhood were both wonderful and exhausting, a blur of midnight feedings and endless diaper changes. Our son arrived on a stormy October night, his first cries mixing with the sound of rain against the hospital windows. James held my hand through every contraction, his presence steady and unwavering, while outside, thunder rolled across the sky like drums announcing our child's arrival. Between midnight feedings and endless diaper changes, I gained a new appreciation for the strength it takes to be a parent. There were moments when I felt like I might break, like the time our son had colic and cried for 6 hours straight, his tiny face red with effort, while I paced our living room floor until my feet ached. Or the night he spiked a fever that sent us rushing to the emergency room at 3 a.m, the city streets eerily empty except for the occasional taxi. But there were beautiful moments too. The way he would fall asleep on my chest, his tiny heart beating against mine like a second pulse. The first time he smiled, a real smile, not just gas, lighting up his whole face with pure joy. The sound of his laughter, like tiny bells ringing, when James would make silly faces at him during bath time. Michelle's visits during this time were mercifully brief. She would sweep in wearing impossibly high heels, wrinkle her nose at the baby mess that had become our new normal, and leave after making pointed comments about how motherhood really does change a woman's figure, doesn't it? The real surprise came when he turned 3. That's when things started getting strange. Chapter 3: The Gift. One sunny afternoon in late September, as we sat in our living room sharing lunch, my son suddenly looked up from his plate of dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets. His eyes fixed on the window, where bright sunlight was streaming in through clear skies. The branches of our maple tree cast dancing shadows on the carpet, and a neighbor's wind chimes tinkled softly in the distance. It was the kind of perfect fall day that makes you want to take a long walk in the park, maybe stop for ice cream.
Mommy, there's going to be a thunder soon. It's going to pour,
he announced with startling clarity, using words I'd never taught him. His small face was completely serious, his dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets forgotten on his plate. A half-eaten piece of broccoli sat abandoned next to them, arranged to look like a tiny tree in his self-created food landscape. I laughed nervously, glancing at the cloudless sky. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies all week, and I'd planned to take him to the playground after lunch. "What makes you say that, sweetie? Look how nice it is outside." But something in his tone made me uneasy. The certainty in his voice was unsettling, more adult than childlike. I stepped out onto our balcony, the concrete warm beneath my bare feet. The air was still and heavy, carrying the scent of sun-warmed asphalt and Mrs. Chen's blooming jasmine from the apartment below. In the distance, I could see the dark clouds gathering, their edges tinged with that peculiar greenish hue that often precedes a storm. As I watched, a low rumble of thunder reached my ears, and I could see sheets of rain advancing toward us like a gray curtain, consuming the bright afternoon sun. The wind began to pick up, carrying with it the metallic scent of approaching rain. My heart began to race. The laundry was still hanging on the line, sheets and towels that would take ages to dry if they got soaked. They fluttered in the strengthening breeze like pale ghosts. I rushed to bring them in, my hands trembling slightly as I unpinned each item. The wind was picking up now, making the sheets snap like sails. "The laundry didn't get wet," I exclaimed, catching my breath, as I pulled the last shirt off the line. Fat raindrops began to fall, quickly becoming the downpour my son had predicted. Thunder cracked overhead, making me jump. Through the glass door, I could see my son still sitting at the table, calmly arranging his dinosaur nuggets as if nothing unusual had happened. "How did you know it was going to rain, sweetie? And where did you learn the word downpour?" He looked at me with innocent confusion, tilting his head to one side. His sandwich was now a mess of crumbs on his plate, and he had a smear of ketchup on his chin.
Downpour? What's that, Mommy?
"But you just said, didn't you tell me there would be thunder in a downpour?"
No way, I don't know that word.
He giggled, returning to his lunch and making playful sound effects as the storm raged outside.
Boom! Flash! Scary!
I stood there, dripping slightly from my dash to save laundry, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The storm continued to pound against our windows, but my mind was far away, replaying my son's words over and over. Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating his face in stark white light. He seemed completely unaware of my confusion, happily making his T-Rex nugget attack its Triceratops companion. This was only the beginning. Over the next few months, my son's mysterious predictions became a regular occurrence. They would come without warning, his voice taking on that same eerily adult tone before he'd snap back to his usual playful self. The predictions ranged from simple announcements like, "Daddy's bringing home a present today," to more specific warnings such as, "There's going to be a small earthquake soon," or "A door-to-door salesperson is coming this afternoon. They're selling vacuum cleaners." What made these predictions even more remarkable was their unfailing accuracy. The day he mentioned James bringing home a present, I spent the afternoon watching the clock, my stomach doing little flips every time I heard footsteps in the hallway. Would this be the time my son's prediction proved wrong? The hands of our kitchen clock seemed to move more slowly than usual, ticking away the minutes until James's normal arrival time. But at exactly 6:15 p.m., my husband walked through the door with a small wrapped package looking sheepish. His tie was loosened, and his hair was slightly ruffled from the autumn wind, but his eyes were bright with excitement. "I saw this and thought of you," he said, handing me a delicate silver bracelet with tiny stars dangling from it. The metal caught the light, sending tiny reflections dancing across the walls. "I know we agreed no spontaneous gifts, but I couldn't resist. It reminded me of that night we went stargazing on our first date." I'd been too stunned to do more than stare at my son, who was happily playing with his toy cars in the living room rug, as if he hadn't just predicted this exact moment hours earlier. The cars made a rhythmic clicking sound against the hardwood floor as he pushed them along his imaginary roads, completely oblivious to my amazement. Another time, when he warned about the earthquake, I'd barely had time to secure the valuable vases on our shelves before the ground gave a gentle but noticeable shake. The crystal chandelier in our dining room tinkled softly, and the water in our fish tank created tiny waves that made our goldfish dart around in confusion. The morning news would later report it as a magnitude 3.2 tremor. Small, just as he'd said. The door-to-door salesperson arrived exactly as predicted, wearing a navy blue uniform and carrying a vacuum cleaner that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. I watched through the peephole as she knocked on every door in our hallway, her practiced sales pitch becoming fainter as she moved further away. But the most perplexing part was his apparent amnesia about these predictions. When I tried to ask him about them later, he'd look at me with genuine confusion, his small face scrunched up in concentration, often while in the middle of some completely ordinary childhood activity. "What earthquake, Mommy? I didn't say anything about that. Can I have apple juice?" he'd say, already moving on to his next thought as children often do. Or he'd be more interested in showing me his latest crayon masterpiece or telling me about the butterfly he saw in the park. It was as if he was channeling information from somewhere else, speaking with knowledge beyond his years, only to return to being my ordinary preschooler moments later. These episodes never seemed to frighten or disturb him. They were as natural as breathing, as casual as commenting on the color of the sky. One evening, after putting our son to bed, I brought up the subject with James. We were curled up on our living room couch, the soft glow of the table lamp creating a cozy atmosphere, despite the weight of the conversation I was about to initiate. Outside, the city lights twinkled like earthbound stars, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed briefly before fading into the usual urban symphony. "Do you think we should be worried?" I asked, my head resting on his chest where I could hear his steady heartbeat. The familiar rhythm was comforting, anchoring me as my mind swirled with concerns. It's not normal for a child his age to know these things, is it? James was quiet for a long moment, his hand absently stroking my hair. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the seconds, its rhythm usually comforting, but now somehow ominous. A car horn honked somewhere in the street below, the sound muffled by our apartment's thick windows. "My mother used to tell us stories about her grandmother having this sight, as she called it," he finally said, his voice thoughtful. His hand paused in its motion, and I could feel him choosing his words carefully. "I always thought they were just family tales, you know, the kind of stories you tell around a campfire. But now, He trailed off, lost in thought. I sat up, turning to face him. The lamp cast half his face in shadow, making his expression hard to read. What kind of stories? She would talk about how her grandmother could sense things before they happened. Small things mostly. Who was coming to visit, when it would rain, that sort of thing. He paused, frowning slightly. But there was one story. Mother said her grandmother once refused to let anyone in the family board a particular train. She was absolutely adamant about it, though she couldn't explain why. The train derailed that day. Several passengers. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. A shiver ran down my spine despite the warmth of our living room. Through the wall, I could hear her son's soft breathing from his bedroom, peaceful and untroubled. Should we tell someone? Get him tested? The words felt strange even as I said them. Tested for what? Precognition? Supernatural abilities? I could already imagine the looks we'd get from doctors or specialists. No, James said firmly, pulling me close again. His arms were warm and solid around me, a barrier against the uncertainty that seemed to be creeping into our lives. The world isn't ready for things it can't explain. Let's keep this between us for now. We'll protect him by keeping it private. I nodded, knowing he was right. In a world that demanded scientific explanation for everything, my son's gift would be met with either disbelief or unwanted attention. Neither would do him any good. Little did I know, then, that this gift would soon reveal something far more sinister than earthquakes or a surprise presence. Something that would shake our family to its core and force us to confront the darkness lurking beneath the surface of our seemingly perfect life. The signs had been there all along. In Michelle's cold eyes and calculating smiles, in the way she watched my growing belly with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sometimes, the hardest truth to face is the one right in front of you, hiding in plain sight like a snake in the garden.